never expected my life to implode during a garden proposal. But that's exactly what happened when Jackson got down on one knee among the roses at Henderson Park, completely blindsiding me with a diamond ring and promises of forever. My name is Lila, and looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. They were there in the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the ring, in how his eyes kept darting toward the bushes where I later discovered his entire family hiding with cameras. "You're my everything," Jackson said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had drawn me to him during all those coffee shop visits. "I want us to be a real family." The word family hit differently then. Maybe because I'd grown up with just my grandmother, or maybe because deep down I knew what I was really saying yes to wasn't just Jackson. Before I could fully process what was happening, his family burst out from behind the bushes. His mother Marlene reached us first, practically shoving me aside to embrace her son. "My baby's getting married," she squealed, while his father Hank started popping champagne they'd apparently brought along. "Welcome to the family, sweetie," Marlene said, finally turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're going to be so close, you'll never feel alone again." Something in her tone made my stomach clench, but Jackson was beaming so bright it was hard to focus on anything else. His sister Tessa bounced around us taking photos, chattering about wedding plans before I'd even had a chance to say yes. "You haven't given him an answer yet, dear," Marlene pointed out, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp as tacks. The garden suddenly felt smaller, more confined. I looked at Jackson's hopeful face, at the family circled around us like a closing net, and heard myself say, "Yes." The word barely left my mouth before Marlene was pulling out a notebook. "I've already started planning the perfect wedding," she announced. "I'm thinking June at the country club." Jackson's cousin Patricia got married there last year, and it was just divine. As everyone talked over each other about dates and venues and guest lists, I caught my reflection in Hank's champagne glass. I barely recognized the woman staring back, the one who just agreed to merge her quiet life with this chaos. "Isn't this perfect?" Jackson whispered, squeezing my hand. "You'll never be alone again." I smiled back, ignoring the way my chest tightened at his words. What I didn't know then was that never being alone again would turn out to be less of a promise and more of a threat. My wedding day arrived with storm clouds and Marlene's voice echoing through the bridal suite. No, those flowers won't do at all. I specifically ordered pink peonies, not these. Whatever these are." I sat perfectly still as the makeup artist worked, watching in the mirror as Marlene dismissed my carefully chosen wildflower arrangements. The same ones I'd spent weeks planning with my grandmother before she passed away last month. Each bloom had meant something special to us. "Mom, maybe we should," Tessa started, but Marlene cut her off with a wave. "Darling, this is what families do. We fix things." She turned to me with that same honey-sweet smile from the proposal. "Lila, dear, you'll thank me later. First weddings can be so overwhelming." First weddings. The words hung in the air like a threat. "I liked the original flowers," I said quietly, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Oh, sweetie." Marlene's hand squeezed my shoulder just a little too hard. "Trust me, the photos will look so much better with the peonies. Now about your hair." The door opened and Jackson poked his head in. "Everything okay in here?" I heard raised voices. "You can't see the bride before the wedding," Marlene gasped, but I was already turning. "Jackson, can we talk?" "Alone?" His eyes darted between me and his mother. "Can it wait?" Mom's put so much work into making everything perfect. Perfect. Like the country club venue I never wanted. Like the guest list full of strangers. Like the first dance song Marlene had chosen because it was more appropriate than our song. "It's about the flowers," I said, standing up despite the makeup artist's protests. "Your mother's changing everything." "Oh, that." He laughed, that nervous laugh I was starting to hate. "Mom's just trying to help. She knows about these things. Remember what happened with Cousin Patricia's wedding? I'd never met Cousin Patricia." Didn't even know if she existed before today. Jackson, these flowers were important to me. They were. All taken care of, Marlene announced triumphantly, hanging up her phone. The peonies will be here in 20 minutes. Crisis averted. I watched Jackson's shoulders relax, saw the relief wash over his face. He wasn't going to fight this battle. Any battle. See, he said softly. Everything's working out perfectly. I turned back to the mirror, catching sight of my reflection again. The stranger staring back wore designer makeup, a dress Marlene had chosen, and an expression I didn't recognize. Behind me, Marlene was already directing the removal of my wildflowers, each discarded bloom another piece of me falling away. Perfect, I echoed, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. The storm clouds outside grew darker, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. The sound of laughter drifting up from my kitchen stopped me cold in the doorway. I just returned from grocery shopping, arms full of bags, only to find Tessa sprawled on my couch, feet up on the coffee table, while Jackson cooked something that filled the house with garlic and oregano. Surprise! Tessa called out, not bothering to move. I brought over Mom's lasagna recipe. Jackson said you'd been trying to recreate it. I hadn't. In fact, I'd explicitly told Marlene I preferred my grandmother's recipe. How did you get in? I asked, though I already knew. The spare key I'd noticed missing from our key hook last week suddenly made sense. Oh, Jackson gave me a copy, Tessa said casually, scrolling through her phone. For emergencies and stuff. You know how Mom worries. The grocery bags suddenly felt heavier. Jackson? Can we talk? He emerged from the kitchen, wearing the apron his mother had given him, the one with Mama's Boy embroidered across the front. What's up, babe? Oh, don't worry about the groceries. Tessa already picked up everything we need for dinner. You gave your sister a key to our house without asking me? Well, yeah. He shrugged, that familiar nervous smile appearing. She's family. I'm your wife, I said quietly. This is my home too. Exactly. Our home. The family home. He gestured around proudly. Mom's so happy we're keeping up the tradition. Did you know this house has been in the Reed family for 3 generations? I hadn't known that either. Just like I hadn't known the spare bedroom I'd been planning to turn into my art studio was apparently traditionally the family's storage room for holiday decorations. Boxes of Christmas ornaments had appeared there last week, courtesy of Marlene's surprise visit. Jackson, we need to talk about boundaries. Oh God, you sound just like Patricia's ex, Tessa piped up. She was always going on about boundaries too. That's why she didn't last. The lasagna timer dinged, and Jackson disappeared back into the kitchen. Let's talk later, okay? Mom's coming over to make sure I got her recipe right. I stood there, groceries growing warm in my arms, watching Tessa flip through our wedding album that she'd pulled from somewhere. She was adding sticky notes to certain pages. Mom thinks we should redo some of these photos. The lighting wasn't quite right. The front door opened behind me, and Marlene's perfume announced her arrival before her voice did. Oh good, everyone's here. Lila dear, you're blocking the doorway. And what are you doing with all those groceries? I told Tessa exactly what to buy for a proper family dinner. I felt the walls closing in, my carefully curated space disappearing under the weight of Reed family traditions. The spare key in Tessa's possession suddenly felt like more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of everything I was losing, one boundary at a time. Through another family dinner turned invasion, I found myself sitting on my front porch at midnight, breathing in the cool night air. The house behind me felt like a stranger's home now, filled with Marlene's decorative touches and Tessa's art supplies that kept mysteriously multiplying in my would-be studio. Rough night. I jumped at the voice, then relaxed when I saw Mr. Everett, my elderly neighbor, walking his dog. He'd lived next door for decades, long enough to remember when Jackson's grandparents owned our house. Just needed some air, I said, watching as he settled onto the porch steps beside me. Noticed quite the parade of Reed family members lately, he commented, his voice carefully neutral. Reminds me of when Patricia lived here. I turned sharply. Patricia? Jackson's cousin? Oh, yes. Mr. Everett scratched his dog's ears. Lived here with her husband about 5 years ago. Sweet girl, very quiet. Until she wasn't. What happened? Same thing that's happening to you, I expect. Started with spare keys, ended with moving trucks. He paused. Though the art studio was a music room back then, my hands started trembling. Did she leave? Middle of the night. Left everything behind except her clothes and her dignity. He glanced at me. Marlene had her redecorating plans ready before the divorce was final. Been waiting to get her hands on this place again ever since. The porch light flickered, and through the window I could see Jackson cleaning up after dinner. Marlene directing his every move while Tessa sprawled across my grandmother's antique armchair, the one that had mysteriously migrated to the garage last week because it didn't match the new aesthetic. This morning, I said slowly, Marlene mentioned converting the master bedroom into a proper guest suite. Said it made more sense for Jackson and me to take the smaller room since family visits so often. Mr. Everett nodded. Patricia's old room. Has a lovely view of the garden Marlene's been redesigning. My garden. The one where Jackson proposed. The one Marlene had been slowly replacing with her preferred flowers, one bed at a time. You know, Mr. Everett said, standing up with a grunt, sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting for your place in a family. It's fighting for yourself. He started down the steps, then turned back. Oh, and Lila? If you ever need help changing locks, I've got a good hardware store recommendation. Can late, no questions asked. I watched him disappear into the darkness, his words settling around me like a warm blanket. Through the window, I could hear Marlene's voice. Now, about those hideous curtains in the master bedroom. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. Felt like clarity. Felt like rage. I came home early from work to find moving boxes in my grandmother's sewing room. Not just any boxes, the expensive kind with Reed family heirlooms printed in gold script across the sides. Marlene stood in the center of the chaos, directing Hank and Jackson like a conductor with her perfectly manicured hands. Oh, Lila. She brightened when she saw me. Perfect timing. We're just setting up my new prayer room. You're what? The words came out strangled. Well, since you're not using this space, she gestured dismissively at my grandmother's antique sewing machine, now unplugged and shoved into a corner. I thought it would make the perfect spiritual retreat. Every Reed home has one. This isn't, I stopped, watching Jackson carefully placing his mother's crystal angels on my grandmother's shelves. The shelves I'd helped Grandma build when I was 12. Honey, Jackson called over his shoulder, can you help Mom decide where to put her meditation cushions? She's thinking of painting the walls lavender. Actually, Marlene interrupted, I'm thinking more of a complete renovation. These old floors have to go, and that window. She wrinkled her nose at the bay window where I used to sit with Grandma, learning to sew. It lets in too much direct sunlight. Bad feng shui. My hands found my grandmother's last unfinished quilt, now crumpled in a donation box. Something inside me snapped. Get out. Excuse me. Marlene's eyebrows shot up. I said get out. All of you. Now. Lila, Jackson started, that nervous laugh bubbling up. Mom's just trying to. To what, Jackson? Take over another room? Erase more of my life? Tell me, what exactly is she trying to do? Now, dear, Marlene stepped forward, reaching for my arm. I know change is hard, but this is for the best. The Reed family. I am not a Reed. The words exploded out of me. This is my house. My grandmother's house. And I want you all out. Now. You can't be serious. Jackson finally turned to face me. This is our family home. No, it's not. It's my home. The one you and your family have been slowly stealing from me, piece by piece. Through the window, I caught sight of Mr. Everett in his garden, pretending not to watch. His words from last night echoed in my head. Sometimes the bravest thing. I pulled out my phone and dialed the hardware store number he'd given me. What are you doing? Marlene demanded. Ordering new locks. I met her eyes steadily. You have 1 hour to get your things and get out, or they're going in the trash. Jackson! Marlene gasped. Are you going to let her? But I was already walking away, my grandmother's quilt clutched to my chest, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out their protests. Behind me, I heard Jackson's nervous laugh turn into something more desperate. For the first time since our wedding day, I didn't care. The locksmith had just finished when Jackson's car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the living room window as he noticed the boxes of his belongings stacked neatly on the porch, everything he'd brought into my grandmother's house, separated and labeled. Lila! His fist pounded against the new door. What is this? Let me in. I stood silent, my hand pressed against the cool wood, remembering all the times I'd opened this door to find his family on the other side, invading my space piece by piece. Babe, come on. This isn't funny. His voice cracked. Mom's really upset. She says you threw away her prayer crystals. They're in the box marked Marlene's spiritual items, I called back, along with the feng shui mirrors and the healing stone she left in my bedroom. Our bedroom, he emphasized. Our house. You can't just. Actually, I can. My voice was steadier than I felt. I checked the deed this morning. This house was left to me by my grandmother. It was never a Reed family home. That's not fair. Mom says. Your mother says a lot of things, Jackson. But she doesn't get to say what happens in my home anymore. His nervous laugh filtered through the door, but it had an edge I'd never heard before. You're acting crazy, just like Patricia. Mom warned me this might happen. The comparison to Patricia hit differently now. I wondered if she'd stood in this exact spot, finding her strength while a Reed man pleaded on the other side of the door. I've called Dad, he continued. He's bringing Mom over to sort this out. We're family, Lila. You don't turn your back on family. No, I agreed. You don't. But your family turned their backs on me the moment they decided to erase me from my own home. His phone buzzed, probably Marlene. I could picture her rallying the troops, preparing another invasion. But this time, the locks were different. This time, I was different. Last chance, Lila. His voice hardened. Open the door, or what? I pressed my forehead against the door. You'll give your mother another key? Let Tessa redecorate my grandmother's room? Tell me more about Cousin Patricia. Silence. Then you talked to Mr. Everett. I did. Funny how your family never mentioned Patricia when you proposed. Or when your mother started moving her things in. Or when. She wasn't ready for the responsibility of a Reed family home, he cut in, sounding exactly like Marlene. Just like you're not ready. I heard cars pulling up, multiple engines, multiple doors slamming. Cavalry had arrived. You're right, I said softly. I'm not ready for a Reed family home, but I am ready for my home. Goodbye, Jackson. His response was drowned out by Marlene's voice, shrill and demanding. But for the first time since our wedding day, I couldn't hear that nervous laugh anymore. And for the first time in months, I smiled. 3 days after changing the locks, I found Tessa sitting on my porch steps at dawn, her usual artistic chaos replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. I talked to Patricia, she said without looking up. Found her on Instagram. She's in Seattle now, teaching art. I sat beside her, keeping distance between us. The morning air felt charged, like before a storm. She told me everything, Tessa continued. About Mom's redecorating. About how Jackson just stood by. About, her voice cracked. About how none of us helped her. Before I could respond, Marlene's SUV screeched to a halt in front of the house. She emerged like a warrior queen, Jackson and Hank trailing behind her. Tessa Reed. Get away from her this instant. No. Tessa stood, her hands shaking but her voice steady. I'm done following orders, Mom. Orders. Marlene's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I'm protecting this family. Just like I protected it from that ungrateful Patricia, and now from... From what? I interrupted, standing beside Tessa. From women who won't let you control them? Control? Marlene advanced up the path. I gave you everything. A perfect wedding, a beautiful home. My home, I corrected. My grandmother's home. The one you've been trying to steal since day one. Steal? Jackson, are you hearing this? But Jackson was staring at something behind us. I turned to see Mr. Everett approaching, carrying a familiar-looking photo album. Found this while cleaning out my attic, he said mildly. Interesting pictures of the last 3 Reed family homes, all inherited by wives, all eventually claimed by the Reeds. Quite a pattern, Marlene. You stay out of this, Marlene hissed, but her perfect composure cracked slightly. Mom, Tessa's voice was barely a whisper. How many were there before Patricia? The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Then Hank spoke, his jovial facade finally falling away. I'd like to know that too, dear. I did it for us. Marlene's voice rose hysterically. For our family. These outsiders, they don't understand our traditions, our legacy. Your legacy of theft? I stepped forward. Of breaking women until they run away or give in? You ungrateful little... No, Mom. Tessa moved between us. You don't get to break this one. I won't let you. Marlene recoiled as if slapped. Behind her, Jackson's nervous laugh had disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. Tessa, he said softly, was this what your art was about? All those paintings of trapped birds? The morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating all of us, the controlling mother, the enabling father, the conflict-avoidant son, trapped daughter, and me, the latest target who refused to break. It's over, Marlene, I said quietly. Your pattern stops here. For the first time since I'd known her, Marlene Reed had nothing left to say. 6 months after the confrontation, I sat in my grandmother's sewing room, my sewing room now, hemming a quilt. Her last unfinished project had become my first, each stitch a reclamation of space and memory. The divorce papers arrived yesterday, tucked between a wedding invitation from Patricia, she'd found love in Seattle, and a postcard from Tessa, who was showing her Broken Patterns series in New York. Her paintings of trapped birds had evolved into images of flight. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I saw Mr. Everett holding his signature coffee mug. Thought you might want to know, he said as I let him in. Marlene and Hank are selling their house. Seems they're taking some time apart to, as Hank put it, figure out who they are without each other. I nodded, pouring him coffee in my grandmother's favorite cup. And Jackson? Therapy, from what I hear. Finally asking questions about family patterns he never noticed before. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning light play across my newly restored hardwood floors. No feng shui mirrors, no crystal angels, no Reed family heirlooms. Just peace. You know, Mr. Everett said thoughtfully, I've watched 3 women face down Marlene Reed from these windows. You're the first who didn't run. I had help, I replied, thinking of Tessa's courage, Patricia's truth, even Hank's final stand. No, he shook his head. You had strength. The others just helped you recognize it. Another knock echoed through the house. This time, Tessa stood on my porch, a canvas tucked under her arm. It's from my new series, she said, unveiling a painting of a house. My house, but transformed. In the windows, birds soared free while broken cages lay empty in the garden. I'm calling it legacy breaking. As I hung it in the entryway, I noticed something in the background, A familiar figure watching from a neighbor's window, coffee cup in hand. Mr. Everett smiled at his painted self. You know, Tessa said quietly. Mom asked about you yesterday. Ashley asked, didn't demand or accuse. I think she's starting to understand what she lost. What she kept making others lose. I touched the frame of her painting, tracing the lines of flight. Sometimes losing everything is how we find ourselves. Is that what happened to you? She asked. I looked around my grandmother's house, at the quilts and paintings and coffee cups, at the spaces between things, no longer crowded with others' expectations. No, I smiled. I didn't lose everything. I remembered who I was and chose to keep her. Through the window, spring flowers were blooming in my garden. Not Marlene's peonies, but my grandmother's wildflowers. Free, untamed, and perfectly beautifully themselves.